So the next portion of the of today is I guess we invite the guest speaker to present about her work, and I'd like to say from the onset that Anne has worked actually probably much more outside of Canada than inside of Canada, and I think we do have to remember that yes, Canada wants to look at the problem internally, but there's probably a lot of stuff happening outside of Canada that cannot be ignored. And so we also need to connect on the broader scale, obviously. So Anne is a senior director for the file of resilience at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which is obviously well known in Canada. A lot of our work has focused on understanding how better environmental management can build resilience to climate stresses and contribute to peace building. Anne's most recent work has been in developing and applying decision-making support tools for climate change adaptation, resilience, conducting participatory field research on livelihoods and climate change, which obviously has become a big issue discussed during this event, and building the capacity of governments and civil society to integrate climate risk into policies and field projects. So I'll give her the floor and probably stop sharing my screen so that she can share her screen.
Okay, thank you so much, Ella, and hopefully folks can hear me and see my screen.
So we hear you well. I'm not too sure if we see your screen though.
Okay, let's try again. Share, try again.
There we go.
Great. And right, okay, so thanks again for inviting me to share some experiences and some reflections from the work that we've been undertaking at IISD for, well, at least the last 5 years, but it goes beyond that really, around, you know, integrated approaches to addressing climate priorities. And here I'm talking about climate adaptation priorities. And as some people in the meeting might know, that IISD has been working a lot in this area of adaptation planning, to some extent in OECD countries, but especially and particularly for the last 5 years in countries in the global south. And I just want to be clear on what I'm talking about when I'm talking about integration, because I know that there's been a whole conversation that's been taking place throughout the dialogues in this meeting about this issue of integration. And so, and forgive me if this is really, really obvious, but I do like to be a bit clear in trying to sort of establish a basis for my own reflections. But first of all, when I'm talking about adaptation and the approaches that we're taking, we're trying to work with different actors in government, civil society, private sector, and fundamentally embedding adaptation in how they envision and plan futures, invest resources, and then track progress. That might sound obvious, but it is sort of really about this issue of embedding. And when we talk about integrated, then obviously it's in terms of an adjective, like what we've heard in the previous presentation, an approach that implicates and cuts across all sorts of economic sectors, jurisdictions, issues, and involves all sorts of different tools. But also, I think, and this will come across more in my presentation, when I'm talking about integrated or integration, it is also about the very much the process of doing all this combining of, you know, bringing these different sectors and jurisdictions and issues together for a common shared objective. And in this case, it's to reduce vulnerability and build resilience to the impacts of climate change. So, so just to sort of set that out. For us, I mean, this is sort of, again, this is going to be obvious to folks working in adaptation, so I'm not going to spend much time on here, but just to sort of say that this is fundamentally what we're working with governments, specifically at the national level, but sometimes at the subnational level as well. And this is what we're trying to provide support in doing and working with them in partnership in doing. And it's to sort of establish and undertake this national adaptation or planning process, or NAP process. And as we know, this is really about analyzing current and future climate change, assessing vulnerability to its impacts, identifying and importantly, as we heard, prioritizing options for dealing with these impacts, implementing these options, and then tracking progress. And when we're talking about working with government actors, primarily in doing this, it's not just about supporting them to establish and undertake this process, which is represented by, you know, this colorful wheel, the sort of outside circle, and also building enabling factors in the middle of that circle. But it's also making sure that this entire process of planning, implementation, and monitoring evaluation for adaptation just becomes standard ongoing practice. It's not a one-off, it's not an ad hoc exercise, it's not set aside from everything else. And so it's really about putting in place the systems and capacities to socialize this approach to planning and resource allocation and tracking progress. So just to say that the experiences and sort of the reflections I'll be sharing for the rest of the presentation really draw from what we've been doing as the Secretariat for something called the National Adaptation Plan Global Network, or the NAP Global Network, where we've been working with in developing countries in national adaptation planning and action. We've been providing, for example, direct technical support to about 42 countries. And we've also been facilitating a lot of South-South peer learning and exchange, and then have been doing a lot of knowledge co-production and communications around this issue of adaptation planning, and trying to dig deep into the different technical aspects of it, because it is such a broad, it feels like all-encompassing exercise, and there are very specific technical elements to it as well. And so, you know, coming into today's presentation, and frankly, you know, it's been lovely, it's been wonderful in the sense that I've, myself and my colleagues have been asked to share these types of presentations in different fora in Canada and other OECD countries. And we're always asking ourselves, what can we usefully share that might be of interest or relevant to OECD contexts? And I think, you know, hopefully as I go through these points, you know, everybody will recognize that there are sort of shared challenges and experiences that are happening around the world that Canada can certainly draw from. And then I'm sure there's also the huge openness amongst our partners in the Global South to learn also from what Canada is doing in this space. I think, you know, the starting point is obviously that the challenges in adaptation planning or embedding adaptation in decision making, the challenges are universal. And that's why we have these enabling factors that we identified in the middle of that circle diagram, that these challenges are really around data, information, and knowledge sharing. Just, you know, not even just sharing, it goes from generation to access to communications. Fundamental to all this is all obviously institutional arrangements, different departments and sectors and actors, knowing who's doing what, when and where, coming together at the right moments to chart a path forward, you know, coming up with the processes and systems. It's a huge endeavor, and it's I would say in many ways that what we do is fundamentally you know, about governance and setting up the right governance structures for any of this to happen. Like I mentioned, there's so many technical elements to it, so that there's a huge capacity building challenge in this endeavor. And then also, of course, we always hear finance, not only to undertake the process of planning, but then of course finance to actually implement the solutions that are identified throughout the process. And then on top of all this, we've got still, and I'm sure this has come up a number of times in the discussions over the last few days, but fundamental understandings of adaptation. You know, for those of us who might be working on this and have been working on this for many years, you know, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that the vast majority of stakeholders still don't understand what we mean when we talk about adaptation. And, you know, trying to find creative ways of not even using that word is sometimes required. And then different people from different, you know, backgrounds will come to the adaptation issue with very different approaches and agendas. I think one of the challenges too is also treating adaptation as in an equivalent manner to mitigation. Totally understand, and I'm completely behind trying to make sure that we elevate the importance of adaptation in coming up with climate solutions and understanding the climate challenge. But always looking for these analogs, these adaptation analogs to mitigation, whether it's in terms of finance or its use of technology, can also trip up, I think, the conversation around adaptation. So that I think that can end up being a bit of a barrier to this entire adaptation decision-making process. And then this won't come as any surprise, the move from planning to implementation, there's this big gap. We see a lot of plans being developed and not nearly as much implementation on the ground. And as time goes on, and as we learn more about adaptation and more people do learn about adaptation, this becomes a huge source of frustration. And then, as we heard in Jason's presentation as well, measuring success indicators for understanding if we're actually doing the right things and if we're having an impact. And so I'll touch on some of this in the next few points. So just to kind of go through some of what we've learned over the last 5 years with running the NAP Global Network, you can't overstate the importance of high-level political support and signaling. Having that clear articulation of commitment, of priorities, of timelines, and accountability from the very top can make all the difference. And we've seen this in the countries with which we've worked. Here we've got a photo of the Prime Minister of Fiji, who made it very clear that adaptation was going to be a priority for his country. And the adaptation planning process sat in the Ministry of Economy, and it was set up and completed within 18 months. And it was a cross-government endeavor, and it was really, really well received, really socialized, involved all sorts of different levels of government, different stakeholders. And, you know, you can sort of compare that to other countries with which we've worked, where it's, you know, 3, 4, 5 years on, and it progresses in fits and spurts. And I think top level leadership and signaling is one of the biggest factors in explaining that difference. We've also, you know, this is partly a communications issue, but also a conceptual issue. But there's always a tension between coming up with sectoral approaches and then this mainstreaming agenda. Ultimately, we want to get adaptation embedded, like I said, into the everyday decision-making structures and approaches and tools that we have at our disposal when we're thinking about the future and allocating resources. But the tendency, for reasons we all understand, is to, of course, really try to carve out, you know, pieces of the challenge. So taking a sectoral approach, understanding what adaptation means in the health sector, the agriculture sector, for cities, for infrastructure. Totally understandable, but then the risk becomes that it just ends up being a standalone and not fully integrated. And so we see this tension play out over and over, both, I would say, in OECD countries and in developing countries. And it's just what we're having to, I think, realize and communicate with partners is that there's just fundamentally a need to shine a light on priorities before folding these priorities into everything else. And so if countries take the approach of coming up with a set of sectoral plans, like this picture is from St. Lucia, and there they came up with an overarching national adaptation plan, and then they developed sectoral adaptation plans. And it might feel like, for some, it might seem like overkill, but this is what they needed to do to really understand what the priorities were going to be in their fisheries sector, in their agriculture sector, in their water and sanitation sector. And this really lays the foundation for then going on to roll it into the national development planning process more broadly, not just focused on climate change. Integrated approaches and integration is messy and often circuitous. This might, again, sound obvious, but we've had, you know, it's been interesting, and it's important to remind ourselves that, you know, we might sort of map out a logic and a rationale to, you know, making sure that adaptation is integrated into regular business. But, you know, there are so many different agendas and frameworks and timelines and competing priorities at play that oftentimes it's about grabbing these moments, understanding when it makes sense to really talk about adaptation, when it makes sense to undertake a risk assessment and then insert the results of those risk assessments into a policy conversation. and it sometimes might feel like it's going backwards, but this is something that we found is about looking for those moments where you can sort of grab on and get it in there. And this is a picture from Ethiopia where I won't go into details because it won't mean anything to anybody who's not very familiar with the context there, but you know, there we had a clean, climate resilient green economy strategy that was laid out, and then in that process, and then sectoral strategies, and you know, then you had to regionalize all this stuff, and so it felt like there were 4 or 5 different big moving pieces. But in the end, we're at a point where we're going to be seeing some. We've gotten to the point where we're going to see some budget allocations made for the adaptation priorities that have been identified by communities and different levels of government. Integration is as relational as it is technical. And I think this is, you know, this might sound like a soft skills kind of, you know, what do you do with this? But I think it's important to remember that, you know, relationships matter in all of this. And where we've seen, again, some of the most impressive progress and some of the most inspiring progress is where the relationships between different actors are the strongest. And you know, people who so people who may not come to the issue with the same level of understanding, but then arrive at a shared understanding of how to proceed. And so the question becomes, I think, for those who are trying to set up these adaptation planning processes, what are the kinds of engagement strategies that you can roll out to engage with different stakeholders and get their opinions, of course, and get the inputs and make sure that adaptation priorities are truly reflective of realities lived in different contexts. But it's also about how do you create the spaces for these relationships to be established and be built, and recognize that sometimes the most inspiring progress is made through informal relationships and dialogue. So that's been a big preoccupation of ours, and so we've put a huge emphasis on peer learning as a result. Communications, this has been, I'm sure this comes up all the time. And so for us, this has been communications in the broadest sense. So it's more than communications, you know, public outreach. It's communication strategies within government, getting adaptation basically socialized across government so that a conversation can be had that isn't confusing, that isn't frustrating. And, you know, for example, in some of the countries we've worked in, there have been situations where government departments might feel somehow threatened if somebody's coming to them and saying, okay, we need to talk about priorities and how we're going to budget for them. And, you know, the inevitable turf wars happen. But so coming up with actual deliberate, thoughtful communication strategies for how to talk about adaptation across government, across the sectors, and then across the different jurisdictions is highly recommended. We've also seen some really great results with media training on adaptation and storytelling, getting journalists together to talk about adaptation, not just always talking about the disasters and the risks, which of course get a lot of attention, but it can sometimes be disempowering. And so talking about what's working and what's changing on the ground. We've also been doing a lot of embedding of communications experts in the different parts of government to do exactly this, to talk about adaptation. And then here we've got an image from a calypso that was produced for the Caribbean region to talk about, to communicate with the public on adaptation. And of course, that is a huge, huge priority as well. There's still a lot of awareness to be built. Gender equality, social inclusion. I won't spend a lot of time on this because I know that this has been a prominent theme for these meetings, but just saying that, you know, in developing gender responsive and socially inclusive adaptation strategies, we've seen that analysis and process is absolutely the bedrock for making this happen. And so it's not only a matter of participation, but making sure that there's sound analysis to understand who's being left out, who's being impacted differently, and then actually using the results of that analysis in articulating what the priorities are and then coming up with the most appropriate implementation strategies. I know that the Government of Canada and other organizations have their gender-based analysis strategies and tools, and that's fantastic. And so we should be rolling those out even more, but also recognize that a lot of capacity needs to be built around those as well. And then tracking progress. I think we've been working with a number of governments in setting up monitoring and evaluation systems for adaptation. And the thing that we really that's been impressed upon us in doing this is that it's just so much more than indicators. I know indicators are important and everybody wants them and everybody needs them, absolutely. But it is also about setting up the actual system for identifying the right indicators, making sure that they make sense a few years later, gathering the information, organizing this information, coming up with the right data protocols and what we're calling data diplomacy, sharing information across different sectors. It's really, really challenging. And then blending knowledges and technologies. You know, we've worked in communities where it's very, very grassroots and, you know, direct consultations to more tablet-enabled systems and coming up with dashboards and centralized databases. There are different ways of doing it, and it's obviously going to be tailored to what's most appropriate and wanted. And also in part of this, just being really committing ourselves to learning from the information that we gather about tracking progress and then reporting out on it as well. And so we're seeing countries now coming up with progress reports on adaptation and communicating out to its citizens what they've done in the last number of years and what's worked and why, and then obviously what's not working. And then finally here, I just want to sort of leave with the reflection that integrated approaches, as we've seen most recently, can really pay off during times of crisis. And so during COVID-19, we were speaking with a number of our partner countries, and those countries that were at a point in their adaptation conversation where they had been able to mix it in with you know, priorities around water and sanitation, around health, around infrastructure. They were assured that adaptation was going to continue to be supported moving forward. And then in those contexts where adaptation was sort of treated as a very separate standalone issue, there was an increasing risk and a concern that progress was just going to stop altogether. And so making sure that those hooks are made and that the win-wins and the integrated options are sort of already in there and made available is critical. And COVID-19 really just sort of shined a light on that. And so I'm just going to end with this. I think some common big questions that IISD works both in Canada and the Global South. And some of these that I've already raised in the previous slides, but public engagement is always a common big question of what's most appropriate, how much, and what's the right level of investment in it. But obviously around the economics of adaptation is just an evergreen issue. It's just growing, and we're seeing more progress on it in partner countries in the Global South, which is great. But I think capacity there is very, very thin. And so whatever Canada's been doing on this, I think would actually be very well received and taken up and with interest by partners in the South. Vertical integration, I think, again, unsurprising that this would be an issue in Canada, but the different levels of jurisdiction and how they can actually speak to each other and work together on adaptation. And then private sector engagement, specifically small businesses. This is a huge issue in the countries with which we work, and it's a growing conversation that we've been tracking at IISD in Canada as well. And just to sort of some food for thought, where we see some interesting opportunities for South-North learning, I think actually the work that's been going on with tracking progress and monitoring and evaluation and of adaptation in a lot of the countries in the global network, I think there's some really, really interesting lessons for Canada to pick up on. I know that Canada is very interested in building on the indicators that have been developed already for adaptation, but as Jason said, taking it to that next level and sort of coming up with the right system and tracking progress. I think there's a lot of lessons around that. And then as well around gender equality and social inclusion. And I will leave it at that, and happy to hear comments and reflections from others as well. Thank you.